Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
If you got money enough, if you're a millionaire, if you can afford to fly and be packed in for $5,000 or $6,000 a week, then you can afford to use that wilderness. All wilderness is for the big money people that can fly in, get what they want, pay for it, and get out.
Tonight, as hearings continue on the Bureau of Land Management's wilderness proposals in Owyhee County, we'll hear the arguments for and against wilderness designation on southern Idaho's high desert. Good evening. The Bureau of Land Management is holding another hearing in Boise tonight on one more controversial Idaho wilderness proposal. But this time the wilderness fight is not over some primitive forest land, but over a rugged area in Owyhee County in extreme southwestern Idaho. The BLM has proposed wilderness designation for over 110,000 acres in Owyhee County, land located 60 to 100 miles south of Boise. It's an area the BLM proposes to call the Jacks Creek Wilderness. This is high desert country, prized for years by cattlemen and by environmentalists. It's an area of deep canyons and sagebrush grasslands. It is home to a rare herd of bighorn sheep. But as a hearing on the wilderness proposal last night in Owyhee County made clear, it is also an area where cattlemen appear ready to make a major stand against no wilderness designation at all. Last night, about a dozen people, most of them ranchers, and all of them opposed to the BLM's proposed wilderness plan, testified at a hearing here in Grandview. Several reoccurring themes throughout their testimony, including the need to close some existing roads and a question of who would profit if part of the Owyees were classified as wilderness.
I think as far as your figures of who is going to make money on this and all this extra money that's coming into Owyhee County, I think possibly the BLM people might have more people working out there. But there isn't going to be any Owyhee County people that are here right now that I believe that will really benefit from it. Wilderness kind of hits a sour note with me anyway because of what's happened on the Salmon River. We now have Wayne Newton owning a heck of a big ranch, private condominiums on the Salmon River in supposedly our wilderness areas. So it doesn't make much sense.
We must ask how these areas could even be designated as wilderness study areas if road closures are necessary to facilitate their management as wilderness. We must also ask why 1,030 acres of federal land in the Tigert Springs area of the Little Jacks Creek Wilderness Study Area is included as wilderness in the proposed action when it did not meet the criteria required to become a part of the previously designated study area. These inconsistencies cast doubt on the integrity of the entire initial review process.
A Bruno man argued that when the government takes control of an area, the area deteriorates. He noted that's what's happened to the town of Bruno.
America just can't afford these non-productive programs. We can't afford those pamphlets that are this thick. We can't afford to fence the range. The fire policies in this area are scandalous. Spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight fires. If you talk to some of the senior citizens in this area, that even in the beginning of their lifetime before BLM came in here, there were never any fires in this area. And that's when the range was utilized. It's always amazing to me during hunting season, people come and want to hunt on my farm. And I say, you own 90% of the ground around my farm, why don't you hunt there? And their answer is, there is no game, there is no birds out there, they're on private land. So, summary, I would say, if you would redraft your study, and give this area a chance to prosper again.
And another man even took exception to the BLM's name for the proposed wilderness area.
You call this Jack's Creek, and it isn't Jack's Creek. It's Jack Creek. I don't see how you can make an impact statement and not even get the name right.
A Grandview resident whose father is partially disabled said that his father and young sons would be unable to appreciate the area if it were designated wilderness.
So I am concerned about the elderly people and also the people with disabilities. How are these people going to enjoy the area that they have in the past? Or those that have always been disabled, how are they going to see this area? I have 2 young children. We function as a family on outings and work and other things that we do. And it's going to be pretty difficult for me to convince my young son that all we got to walk is another 5 miles and it's only 90 degrees out there.
And finally, this testimony from a rancher who owns land on Jack Creek.
I'm the 4th generation on that ranch. My children are the 5th. I probably know Jack Creek better than any man alive. I've fished it, I've hunted it, I've buckarooed it from the top to the bottom since I was a little fella big enough to get on a horse. I've walked it before that. My dad loved to fish that canyon. Every day that he could get off, he'd go to that canyon to go fishing. I don't think that's a wilderness, and I don't think it should be declared a wilderness. This canyon is accessible by road to the edge of the rims on pretty near every side. It isn't a wilderness, it's a cow pasture. It's been a cow pasture since the first settlers come to Buena Valley more than 150 years ago. And that's all it is. There's no trees there. Few willows in the bottom of the creek, no trees on the plains. You have a sharp divided canyon, and you're trying to make a wilderness out of nothing but a cow pasture.
Those comments last night at a BLM hearing in Grandview. Another hearing was held in Boise this afternoon, and it will continue in about a half hour from now. More now on this high desert wilderness debate, first with the Bureau of Land Management. Joe Zimmer is the Boise District Manager of the BLM. First, Mr. Zimmer, was that the sort of thing that you expected to hear last night, what the little sample we just showed on videotape there?
Yes, I think pretty much, Mark. Wilderness is an emotional issue as evidenced by what's going on now with the Forest Service and the congressional efforts to resolve that problem. Where we are at now is in the second phase of a 3-phase study. We started out with the inventory as directed by Congress through FLPMA that was passed in 1976. And what
FLPMA is the Federal
Land Policy Management Act, yes. And that act directed the Secretary of Interior to take a look at those lands that were 5,000 acres and more in size and roadless to see whether or not they would meet the wilderness criteria. That would be if the areas were natural in size, or you could experience naturalness there, primitive recreation, solitude, and the imprints of man were pretty much unnoticeable. As that inventory phase was completed then, the Secretary would be reporting back to the President periodically to let the President know what areas should be considered for future inclusion in the wilderness system. That act did not give the Secretary an indefinite amount of time in which to do that. 15 years is the maximum, so by 1991 that has to be completed. The President has a couple more years till 1993 to get that in front of Congress. The kicker on all of this is that while we are under study, those areas have to be managed under our interim management policy guidelines. So they're very restrictive measures.
Right.
Okay, now the second phase of that then is to do the study phase, which is where we are now. We've gone through the inventory process. There's been discussion about whether the areas are eroded or not. That has been pretty well resolved. We are in the study phase now, and what we're looking at are the areas that survived that initial inventory. We're trying to conduct those studies with people. We don't want to plan for people and let them know here's a plan. What we want to do is to say, all right, here's our proposals. We've got 7 alternatives out there. What do you think? And that's where we are right now.
That's the process you're in last night.
That's the process.
The hearing in Grandview last night, and as I mentioned, the hearing continues here later on tonight. It seems to me, if I read the various positions correctly here, that the BLM is basically between two very polarized positions.
That's
the
right.
cattlemen on the one hand who say no wilderness at all in Owyhee County, and the conservationists who want much more than BLM has proposed.
Exactly.
That's your position.
We're right in the middle.
Well, just tell me how BLM at this point has settled on that 110,000 acre figure that I mentioned a moment ago.
Well, we've gone through and looked at the areas to see what areas could we manage, what's really feasible out there. Do these areas have the characteristics that we mentioned before to meet the Wilderness Act? And that's what we settled in on.
Okay, finally, is it Jack's Creek or is it Jack Creek?
I don't really know. I've heard it both ways, and I wouldn't debate the issue. Whatever people want to call it, we'll call it that.
Okay, we'll come back, sir. Thank you. Now, let's hear from the two opposing points of view in this wilderness debate. On the one hand, the cattlemen, represented here tonight by Gene Davis, who ranches in Owyhee County, and the environmentalists, represented by Chris Yoder of Boise, a member of the Middle Snake Group of the Sierra Club. Mr. Yoder, you first. Did I state it right that the environmentalists are on one end of the spectrum, the cattlemen on the other, and the BLM somewhere in the middle?
Well, certainly the BLM comes in between the cattlemen and the environmental community. We feel the environmental community is quite close to the middle. There have been a lot of compromises already made on land management and wilderness issues before it ever got to the study stage that it's in now.
But as a matter of fact, you want, or the conservation groups generally would like to see about 175,000 acres as opposed to the 110 that the BLM is proposing.
That's exactly correct. In the inventory stage that Mr. Zimmer earlier mentioned, the BLM ignored or found not suitable for study large roadless areas that we feel are outstanding, are natural, and do in fact meet the criteria for management as wilderness. Those areas were not studied and are not included in the 175,000 acres we're now talking about. So by BLM's own criteria, the areas left are outstanding in terms of naturalness and in terms of other wilderness characteristics.
And Mr. Davis, you don't agree with that?
That's exactly right.
Why not, sir?
I've been in that country a long time and run cattle in that specific area. We feel we have given as much as we can. We know that there are now 3.8 million acres of wilderness in the state of Idaho. With a congressional request concerning the Rare 2, we would be at 4.2 million acres. That will probably go higher on a compromise. We in Owyhee County don't feel, just as our late Senator Frank Church felt, that there is really any wilderness area in Owyhee County. He stated that many times. There should be no wilderness in Owyhee County. Ted Trueblood, the late Ted Trueblood, a good friend of mine, stated the same thing. We in that area feel that our use over the years apparently has not deterred the good condition of the area, or the thought that these folks, the environmental community, would like to lock this up as wilderness. If we had mishandled and overgrazed, abused the area, why are they asking to lock it up, that it's a natural area? We think we've done a good job in most cases. Of recent years back, yes, before the advent of the Taylor Grazing Act, there were abuses. A lot of that land has restored itself. We just feel that the Bureau has, in many cases, blatantly ignored regulations printed in their own brochures as to how interpretations of the assessment process should go, that they have ignored those. And, it's Mr. Zimmer's folks who are misinterpreting that. That's our problem.
You heard the fellow on the videotape, the last fellow's last comment there, that you're not really, in his view, you weren't talking about a wilderness here, but a cow pasture. Is that what it comes down to, that this area really does not, in your view, have the kind of specialness, if you will, that wilderness areas should have?
I would differ. It has specialness. Certainly to those of us who live there, it has great specialness. And it'll continue that way as a special area to us. And we take pride in the things that we've done, building pipelines, our own dollars, many cases no government dollars whatsoever, and are willing to install these pipelines to give the Bureau, in this case the BLM here in Boise, a better capability of managing that area as we join with them in making multiple use. This is what we think that ground should be managed for.
Well, I don't know whether I've created a new word here, specialness or not, but what is special about that area, Mr. Yoder?
Well, the specialness varies from area to area. There are a wide and diverse number of areas, canyonlands and grasslands.
Well,
both.
what are the stakes? What do we gain by designating this area wilderness?
Okay, I think that's a good question. I think Mr. Davis made some points that that need to be addressed when you address what's at stake. The fellow on the last night at Grandview talked about it being a cow pasture, and I think that this illustrates very clearly what the cattleman's view of multiple use is, and we feel that it's a broader concept that you can have multiple use. In fact, even under the all wilderness alternative in the Jacks Creek area where Mr. Davis ranches, cattle use would increase by 21%. So it's not a lockup, as Mr. Davis tried to imply earlier. Grazing and wilderness are compatible, but wilderness is naturalness. There are few islands left of naturalness in the country, in Idaho, and in Owyhee County. Few areas where the hand of man has not shaped the terrain. Few areas where the terrain is still the way it was created. Very few areas where the vegetation on the terrain remains natural, the way it was created. The Jacks Creek Plateau is one of those areas, and we feel very strongly that that small island of naturalness in a sea of overgrazed desert should be protected. And Mr. Davis indicated that he didn't feel it was overgrazed. The overgrazing is well documented. I don't know what percent of Owyhee County is in excellent range condition, but it's very small, less than 5%.
So you would disagree with Mr. Davis when he says that the area has basically been protected by the people who use it up to this point?
Absolutely. It's been protected for their single purpose, grazing. You can still graze, and there's a lot of grazing potential there. But for multiple use, for protection of the soil, for protection of the rangeland, for protection of the scenic values, for protection of the riparian zones, for protection of wildlife, it's not been protected. It's been abused.
Mr. Davis?
I think Chris and I are good friends. I've had Chris out in that country. I've showed him some of the things we do, and he starts leaning toward me, and then I find that after he comes back to Boise and visits with his friend, then he leans back the other way.
I'm just polite when I'm with you, Jim.
He's taking out of context a statement, I think, or zeroing in on a statement made by a neighbor rancher of mine in Bruno last night as being a cow pasture. And David Latnan did not mean that in a connotation that he's construing it to mean. He's a multiple-use person also. We see, because of some of the management practices we've instituted, pipelines, management of the grazing process, we see increased wildlife there. We've seen the sheep herd, which has been mentioned so many times. We've seen that increase and succeed probably better than any sheep implant in the whole state of Idaho. Numerous harvesting times when they've harvested sheep to transplant to other areas, some sheep taken by game there. And again, they wanted, what, 100 head? That was what they were shooting at when they planted the 12 head there in 1967. They now say, yes, excess of 150. We who live there and see them say there's over 200 head of sheep there. And I would bet a pretty good sum of money that Joe Zimmer, inside of a year and a half, 2 years, you will come to our figure that there are 200 head of sheep there. By then, we'll be at 225 or so.
Well, let me just ask you both one more question, then we'll bring Mr. Zimmer back in this. Mr. Davis, obviously those folks that we saw on the videotape who were at that hearing last night were angry. What are they angry about? Are they angry about this entire process, about the way the BLM has handled it? Are they angry with folks like Chris Yoder? What are they angry about?
I think we're frustrated as much as being angry, and we're frustrated because of the things we have to go through to refute some of the assumptions made, in this case by the BLM. We think that a lot of people from the environmental community really don't understand that. We welcome those folks to come out, as I have done with Chris, and tour them around and show them some of the things. And I'm sure Chris would admit that he learned some things there that he didn't know before. Still, we're wide apart, yes, on what the final settlement should be. But no, it's the frustration of we ranchers, producers, farmers, producers of food and fiber in this country. We're productive people. We have to be, or we're not in business. And we're frustrated with the time and the cost and the effort of, again, refuting or trying to position ourselves, our industry, and what we think is best for the state of Idaho in conjunction with what we think is misrepresentation and of the guidelines and the intent of Congress in the passage of FLPMA.
Mr. Yoder, do folks from your end of the spectrum here, do they have gripes with the way BLM has handled this too?
We feel that BLM has been trying hard. They're kind of new to the multiple use game. Before 1976, before the enactment of the Federal Land Policy Management Act that Joe mentioned earlier, they were not a multiple use agency. They were a grazing service. And so they're a little bit new, and they've been under a lot of political pressure. They've seen their state director exiled to Africa, really forced into early retirement because he didn't get along with the cattle community. They see people transferred all over, so it's difficult for them. They're operating under a lot of pressure.
But some of that pressure comes from you folks too.
We try and provide some countervailing pressure.
Right, okay.
And,
but on the balance, I hear you saying the BLM has done a reasonably good job in dealing with this particular issue.
they have been, we feel, overly responsive to the concerns of the people who oppose wilderness, particularly when you consider that wilderness management protects existing use. For instance, grazing by law can continue in the same manner and degree as it did prior to wilderness designation.
Okay, let me, I don't want to interrupt you, but let me get Mr. Zimmer back in this. It sounds like you're catching it from both ends here.
Well, it's kind of typical for our agency. You know, we're always in the hot seat. On this particular issue, I applaud the efforts of the livestock community and the conservation groups to get together. Unfortunately,
doesn't sound like they're very much together.
They haven't gotten together enough to really work out their differences, and as long as they continue, we're going to be polarized. Mr. Davis mentioned having Chris Yoder out to the ranch. I think those are very positive steps and should continue. Our folks look at this as a job that we have to do. We're hired, we're paid salaries to do that. Congress has given us some guidelines, and that's our responsibility.
Well, let me just go back quickly to one thing that Mr. Davis said about, and his word, not mine, that you have blatantly ignored some of the guidelines in your own regulations about what to consider, as I understood it, what to consider as wilderness land.
Well, I think we'd have to talk specifics there. You know, that's a pretty general statement, and I don't think that that's a very true statement.
Can you give me one specific, Mr. Davis?
Yes, in a policy manual dated 1978, it indicates that wilderness will not be created to benefit any other use. In several instances through the Jack's Creek Wilderness Draft EIS, it states that if we go wilderness, this will benefit the sheep herd. And we think that they're using we think that's completely 180 degrees from what they were instructed to do. Several instances, roads,
benefit
ways,
the big
one of the
sheep group. Yeah, okay.
If you are to declare a wilderness area, you have no roads in the area. They're talking of closing roads. And we say that that is blatant disregard of what really constitutes a wilderness from the beginning.
Mr. Zimmer?
Well, you can bring in the bighorn sheep, and wilderness would help the bighorn sheep population, but it isn't necessary for the bighorn sheep population. I think what we have to talk about are the area's qualities in terms of naturalness, solitude, getting back to those basic things that does constitute a wilderness. Let Congress decide how much of this area should be set aside. It's not a cow pasture. There aren't roads in there. There are a lot of acres out there. You can experience the solitude, and this is what we hear, and this is what we have to come forward with and say, all right, now, how much should really be preserved? That's the job that we have to come to grips with.
But let me just go back to this road issue, though.
Okay.
We had some different interpretations of whether there are roads that have to be closed. Are there roads that will have to be closed?
There are some what we would call cherry stem roads that intrude into the wilderness area and dead end, say, 2-3 miles into the wilderness area to a spring, for example. Those areas were carved down and not included in the wilderness study inventory process. In the analysis that we've been doing with the Jack or the Jack's Creek, however you want to pronounce that, we've said that you can also enhance those areas. For example, in Tigard Springs, where there is a road that goes to a spring, that area would be closed to recreational use, but it would be open to rancher use. Ranchers have legitimate rights out there. They would be able to continue using that road for livestock purposes.
Mr. Davis, you want to make a point on that?
Of course, Joe was talking about grandfathered uses, but we think those are tenuous uses. We've seen so many times in the last 18 years since the creation of wilderness under the United States Forest, and this is a way The BLM wilderness will be administered under this act, and numerous people have the restrictions to graze and the things that take place, no more vehicles, you have to pack salt to this area, these sort of things, and been so restricted that people have just walked away from permits that they've owned and ceased to run cattle.
And that's your fear with some of your
That's my
neighbors.
fear, and it's stated in a Bureau publication that Congress is aware of this, and they stayed for 15 years. That was 3 years ago it was printed, that Congress is aware of this, but they refuse to deal with it. And again, this gets to the interpretation, the intent of Congress, and what is actually being done here.
Mr. Yoder?
That same publication, the BLM's Wilderness Management Regulations, states very clearly that if vehicles were used to put salt out before wilderness, vehicles can continue to be used. The only restrictions is if vehicle use would seriously impair the wilderness values and, big and, it's economically feasible to use a non-motorized method.
So you're really saying that Mr. Davis and his neighbors out there don't really have much to fear from wilderness designation, that they can do almost all the same things that they do now?
The only thing they have to fear is that they will then be faced, if areas are wilderness, they'll be spotlighted in the attention of a lot of people. People will be aware of the area and what's happening to them. The areas will have to be managed for uses other than solely grazing, which means that they'll be faced with real multiple use for the first time probably in their careers. And this, I suspect, is what they really fear.
Mr. Davis?
And of course that's an untrue statement, and Chris knows that I don't believe that.
Actually.
These areas will have use by more people and not the privileged folks who can afford wilderness, as was indicated by my neighbor. Basically, those are the folks who can and will utilize the wilderness area. It's there anyway. Why do we take away the right for a lot of my neighbors who are too old to get into that country if they had to walk or to go horseback? Why do we lock it away from them? People who grew up in that area, some people who homesteaded, actually were raised in some of this area. And Chris and his folks call this wilderness. It's more wilderness today than it was back in the 30s because those folks aren't homing in those areas today. And we're making utilization of it through grazing and multiple use. And we're distributing antelope and deer by placement of water. The game is much better because of the things we do.
I just have a few seconds left, Mr. Yoder.
Two issues. Wilderness is for the rich. Obviously false. The rich can always buy solitude. They can always buy naturalness. But only by protecting wilderness areas will we, the people, and our descendants be able to enjoy it, because a wilderness doesn't know how much money's in your wallet. It only knows that you're willing to take the land on its own terms. On the issue of...
I just have 10 seconds left.
Access to the old or disabled would not be restricted because there'd be no change. It would be kept as it is. If they can't get there now, they wouldn't be able to. If they can, they can.
They can get
Mr.
there
Zimmer,
by
just in a
wheels.
word, the comment period will be open until the early part of November.
November 2nd.
Okay.
Right.
Well, I'm not sure we settled anything, but it was a fascinating discussion. Mr. Zimmer and Mr. Davis and Mr. Yoder, we thank you, gentlemen, for being with us tonight. That's our time for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.